Thank you, Finlanda Trust, for inviting me, and I want to congratulate with organizing this because I think it's very important, and we also have some very fine days. Um, I'm, um, I'm, I will introduce myself a little because I'm here on a quite formal position. I'm a representative of the UNESCO World Heritage of the Lower German Limes on the Dutch part, and I will explain something about it. But um, I will talk a little about process, not too hot, but it's we have to do it about to take responsibility. But I hope we also, I can also talk about cooperation. So I hope that are the three main words I think that we use today. And I may talk on it, I called it levels. Sorry for sometimes my English, but I do my best to get my message over. Um, I talk about on the level of the Lower German Limes. Sometimes I talk more on the Dutch situation, the Lower German Limes. I will explain this Germany and the Netherlands together. Sometimes I talk about the situation in the Netherlands. Then I make a jump to make it worldwide and talk a little with all the management groups and the Bratislava group of the Limes World Heritage together. And I come back on my own level of the Lower German Limes in the Netherlands, so that you can understand that the things that I say has every time a little bit other background. Who are we? I know all the people who are sitting here understand it, but it's useful to know that the Lower German Limes is 350 kilometers of Roman border, Roman frontier, partly in the Netherlands and partly in Germany. In 2021, we were very proud because we got the inscription of the Lower German Limes, and everywhere in the Netherlands, deputies and other important people raised the flags for celebrating UNESCO. And then another view on it, the Limes is not only the Rhine, the River Rhine, with the ports on the south bank, but it's a wider zone of a defensive and a logistical system which has planted by the Roman army in Germany and in the Netherlands. In fact, the line is the history, is the story of the Roman Limes of the Lower German Limes. In fact, 44 numbers. 44 numbers, but in fact 106 terrains are the World Heritage. That's different than, I think, a large part of the Hadrian's Wall. I think that's a complete stretch. We have there's a selection of the best preserved sites with together representing the history of the Lower German Limes, and that is picked in 44 numbers, 106 sites. Our story, our part of the Lower German Limes, is a segment of the complete history of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. And in this thematic study, made in, I think, 2015, a few colleagues have defined what is special for the Hadrian's Wall, what is special for the Antonine Wall, and also what is special for the Lower German Limes. Now, you can see here the key values as together the OUV, the outstanding universal value of the Lower German Limes, is defined by these 6 key values. And as I said, together they are represented in 106 component parts, 44 numbers, because A, B, C, that doesn't matter for now. And in those terrains, those monuments, hold attributes like the military installations and the associated features. And in that, there's the archaeology that represented the outstanding universal value. And I mention it, I mention it because those these monuments we need to protect to keep the outstanding. We have the task to keep the outstanding universal value protected, and that is we do it by protecting the sites. It's it looks normal, but that is you have to understand it every time that we are not talking about one terrain, but we are talking about only in our segment already 106 component parts. So protecting the OUV is protecting that archaeological sites that represent it. In the Netherlands, we organized it by the 3 provinces. We have 3 provinces along the Rhine. And they have a small site bureau. I'm the archaeologist of that, and we have a leader, and we have a public outreach person. That is, the 3 persons are really formal, responsible for protecting the world, for organizing the protection of the World Heritage. But don't forget, there are 26 municipalities who do the real work. And we got 3 provinces who also do the real work, and we work together with the state service. But we have to organize because we have to know what is the situation of our World Heritage. And for that, we have our own working group, protection and research. And every month we check the situation. And that's a place where we can try to get control over crisis situations, but we can exchange best practices and things like that. But overall, that working group protection is the place where we protect and also coordinate research on the Lower German limes. And because of our transnational status of the limes, we also have the same working group protection, but then together with our German partners. That's just once in half a year. It's on a higher level, but know that together we are responsible for protection of the Lower German limes. In the Netherlands, because we are together with our German partners, but in the Netherlands we have organized things differently than on the German side. So now I'm focusing more on the Dutch situation. In the Netherlands, we have managed after 20 years of preparing. It's a beautiful effort. That of a result, the state service has organized a permanent monitoring system for the limes, but it's part of a monitoring system for 1,400 archaeological monuments. So it's not happening every day that the limes is it's a turn for the monitoring of the limes. Just once in a 6 year, we are our sites are monitored. They have a preference position because in the first round of the monitoring, the limes sites were done, were researched. It's a small but quite thorough way of monitoring. On the first, there's a desktop research, and there's already archive on all the archaeological sites of the Netherlands, all the scheduled monuments, but also on the limes sites. And there's a visual inspection, and now some general administration on the situation of the site is reported. Because of, I think, most of our sites are buried sites, all those sites has also a coring sampling program. And this part comes in the neighborhood of the work that Gillian and Andy are organizing here. the blah 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 project. uh, and I think this is so. In the Netherlands, there's already a lot of experience also with this kind of research, but it is too intensive to export it to all the to all the archaeological sites in the Netherlands. But we are working partly. We are working on that, so I think that can be we can no, we can come together in that. I will talk about that later. The result of the monitoring project is, of course, a report. So over 6 years, we can see what are the difference. We can evaluate the situation over the next years in comparison with this year. And very important is there will be a report, a letter to the landowner, and we would like to organize that you take care for it or improve situations, or just say it's quite all right. It's hard. A lot of our monuments are not owned by the group who is organizing the limes. We have a lot of private owners, and even we know all the owners, but the contact to the owners is quite hard, and sometimes we even don't have access to the monument. Things to improve, but most of the people are willing to get the monitor done. The report of the 25 campaign will be published in 2026, but we had a preliminary meeting on that, and that is very useful for the meeting today. The main threat at this moment is drought of most of our sites. So that is that gives us the opportunity to come here and to find some solutions. Before I go to the end, I want to go to a higher level. We are talking here about drought, about buried archaeology. Even the site like Magna is really comparable to most of our sites in the Netherlands. There's not too much walls and stones like in the Netherlands. Most of our sites, we don't have stones anymore because all the churches are built from it. So we can understand it, but as I talked in earlier, our World Heritage is much wider and diverser than this kind of sites. And it should be useful to understand that there are more the sites and the materials that represent the outstanding universal value and other archaeological values are different. You got stone, you got organic materials, but also the situation in in the landscape or on the surface. Some are visible, some are not visible, some are visible but existing of organic materials, some are visible and are stone. A lot of archaeology is buried, so we need to, it depends on what kind of site it is and what kind of situation it is. Also defines the threat it is under of climate change or other developments. So we can have a lot of environmental archaeological monitoring projects, but I think for a lot of monuments, these are not the solution. So we need more specialization. One idea of the Bratislava group, an advisory group of archaeologists from all the segments of the World Heritage sites of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. In that Bratislava group, we have decided to make a separate working group, and in that working group, we could work out this kind of ideas and try to work together. I just mentioned some possible cooperation couples. but these are things to discuss. But it's good to find each other, to work together, and to get specialized in the research methods, but also get specialized in finding for solutions, of course, because that is where we are talking to. Back to the Netherlands, but not only the Netherlands. I am in a lot of contact with the Vinderlanden initiative, very interested, and also with the CVI initiative. We were in the Limes Congress in Georgia, and there you had a very good session on climate change. And I thought, well, we should join that, and you invite us also to join you. So I'm here. So I hope we can work together. But also in the Netherlands, there's a lot of initiatives. Of course, the government is busy with heritage and climate mapping. The province of Zuid-Holland is very enthusiastic also in try to find ways to identify the problem of heritage and climate change. So what we really would like to do is to find a way to work together, but also in a way that it helps us working together with our Dutch partners and also with our German World Heritage partners. So that is, I think, quite a puzzle. Now, what really my idea should be that as soon as possible we could discuss and work together to have probes like you placed in some sites of the Netherlands, so we can extend the amount of data and work together. And meanwhile, we will work on more the classifying of sites so that we can also have this kind of cooperations on other themes and on protecting the world heritage. So I hope to realize it next year, and thank you for everything.
Well, thank you very much for that, Tom. That's absolutely, I think, the aspiration of the Vinderlanden Trust. I'm sure many other organisations in the room as well, is to work together in partnership to try and tackle these truly, I mean, they're global challenges, and so we can't work in isolation on them. Are there any questions for Tom on that excellent presentation? Stunned silence in the room. Yes, Barbara.
If you've got any, like the presentation that was just before where the volunteers were being used to kind of promote and spread the message. Is there programs in the Netherlands that are doing that type of work?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also one in the. I was very impressed by that volunteer program, and we also have along the Limes. We're working. It's quite hard because of the different locations, the different presentation units as we have. But especially in the province of Zuid-Holland, we're working on bringing them together, and we think that the climate change would be an extra way to bring volunteers and even new volunteers together, to bring them in the Limes, because the Limes is, of course, on Roman history and archaeology. Maybe that's also partly an old story. When we make our offer wider for more people who are more technical, you want to do the thing with technical things or with geo information, we hope that we can find new volunteers to make our archaeological society a little bit wider. So we are really interested in that, and I think that when in the first province that will help, then the other provinces are also very interested in that. Yeah. And we really would like to learn from you on that.
Thank you very much, Tom. Damien, you've got a question.
I would be a couple of years ago, there was on the news that, for example, huge barges that came from Germany from the chemicals work couldn't go over, there wasn't sufficient water for to be able to export the product, and also there was of the cruise ships that couldn't go up and down. So I would imagine there must be a wider understanding through the Netherlands and Germany of the real life impact. Does that help focus people's thinking towards their heritage and history and archaeology?
It's hard to repeat the question for me.
So do modern considerations of the impact of the dropping of the water levels on the Rhine or those tributaries, and the difficulties, the challenges that people have now, just living their daily lives, does that register with them that this is also impacting their history and their archaeology as well, do you think?
Yes, I'm sure that that will help. We have in the Netherlands a very special situation because we see everywhere problems with water and drought, but the whole Netherlands, or half of the Netherlands, is organized in polders. You know probably the word, and all our water level is already completely organized. So the impact of we don't have nearly direct impact of climate change. The real impact we have is the political decisions, how high we chose, people chose how high we keep the water level. But I'm sure that some rivers are sometimes too dry, and we sometimes have some flooding. And these are very interesting subjects to get people interested, and also in relation to heritage. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those answers, Tom. Thank you very much for those questions as well. Can we put our hands together, please, one more time for Tom?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Dommett. I'm the head of Archaeology and Heritage Landscapes at the National Trust, and I'm very sorry that I can't be with you live today. I'm very sorry myself to be missing out on listening to your other wonderful speakers. I'm going to open up the lens a little bit and speak fairly broadly to how the National Trust is considering climate change and the historic environment. And I hope that there is some resonance between that broader take and the more specific context that you've been hearing about today. So let's start with the National Trust. And the National Trust may initially conjure up images for many of the country house, of fine porcelains and Van Dycks and clipped formal gardens, and it is those things, but it is much, much more than that too. Spanning across 800 miles of coast and nearly 250,000 hectares of land, across which are almost 100,000 archaeological sites and monuments that we know of, making up a really unparalleled national collection, from the largest stone circle in the world at Avebury Henge to abandoned atomic research facilities at Orford Ness in Suffolk, to Roman mines in Wales at Dollar Coffee, to medieval monasteries like Fountains Abbey, and of course there are some portions of a certain wall in there too that I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. And it's not just a case of amazing individual sites, but actually whole landscapes, and the historic environment as the warp and weft of those places, the patterns of settlement and industry, fieldscapes, routeways, all of which underpin their character and distinctiveness, from the mining landscapes of North Cornwall to the fens of East Anglia or the valleys of the Lake District. And none of these are exempt from the impacts of climate change, not just the direct impacts and the need for climate adaptation, but also recognizing the role that our places must play in mitigating climate change to store more carbon to address the decline in nature. And one of the first steps for us has been in trying to assess the exposure of our places and our heritage to climate change hazards. And you can find this mapping on our How We're Tackling Climate Change webpage at the Trust. We've developed a spatial GIS tool looking across various scenarios for climate change into the future and those projections. And that really has shown not just that all of our places will be impacted, but that they will be encountering different combinations of hazards from erosion, floods, drought, and so on. And these then translate into different direct impacts and indirect impacts too. So changes to vegetation patterns, changes to land use, and of course, different types of heritage, from a ruin to an earthwork or a buried prehistoric land surface, and different aspects of what makes that heritage significant will also be then impacted in different ways. In a word, it's complicated. It's full of uncertainty. It requires us to observe, to adapt, to test, to learn. And while we can try to quantify things at a national scale, our responses will always need to be very place specific. And at the same time, that scale of the challenge requires us to confront some of the bigger ideas we have about what sustainable conservation or preservation looks like, how we manage change, how we consider loss of heritage. And so I guess in that context, my hope today is just to share with you some of that learning, some of that thinking, some of that testing that we've been doing and working with others. So one of the most visible impacts of climate change, and maybe one of the first things that people think of, is at the coast. And it's where some of our earliest thinking developed at the Trust through our Shifting Shores work. Coastal erosion isn't new in itself, of course, but it is a natural process that is accelerating as a result of climate change. And across our 800 miles of coastline, we have, as you might imagine, a considerable number of archaeological sites. And it's here where we must most visibly confront some of the issues of loss. In a world of limited resources, it's prompting really difficult discussions around where to prioritize our efforts, thinking not just about the heritage, but also the communities which can benefit from it and what they believe to be significant. So here at Dinas Dinth, you can see in the bottom right in North Wales, you can see in the image the outline of a prehistoric hilltop enclosure and settlement, with a good proportion of it already disappearing into the sea. And at this site, we've worked in partnership with the Cherish project in Wales to document and investigate the site before it's lost through paleoenvironmental, through geophysical surveys, through excavation, and doing that with the involvement of local volunteers, school groups, and visitors, and allowing us to really reconstruct and interpret the site throughout its long history of development, of occupation, of abandonment. Essentially converting that physical access and evidence into virtual, digital, and intellectual access, and allowing us actually to share it with many more people and in many new ways. In the short to medium term, though, the inevitability of loss at the site is prompting us to challenge some of the norms of archaeological practice. So as part of our excavations, we revealed these stunning stone footings of an Iron Age roundhouse on the site. And normally, and particularly in a scheduled site like this, we would be reburying these remains to protect them. But recognizing that they will vanish in the not too distant future, we were able to work with the regulators to instead have the opportunity to leave these remains exposed and interpreted for visitors to enjoy. So here, the impacts of climate change have prompted us to discover more about the site. And in so doing, the site is helping us not just to tell the long history of landscape change over the past 10,000 years, but also it has real value actually in the very visible reality of its being lost and the imminence of that, communicating and raising awareness of the change that is happening now and the consequences of that change into the future. Now, much of the coastal erosion that we see is not actually caused by wave action. It's a result of the heavy rainfalls contributing to cliff collapse. Inland, those heavy rainfalls have other impacts, of course. So here you can see the World Heritage Site at the medieval Fountains Abbey and later associated designed landscape of elaborate water gardens at Studley Royal. It's a site of international importance, but increasingly we were seeing those intense downpours resulting in flooding of the River Skell that runs through the site, and which of course is so fundamental to why the abbey, why the gardens were established here in the first place. But now that river increasingly flooding is causing all sorts of issues for the surviving remains, for the building, for the archaeology, erosion, undermining the stonework, obviously restricting access to the site, and so on. And so here we realized that we really needed to take an adaptation approach that looked far beyond the individual site to consider solutions at a whole catchment scale. And it was no good here just trying to build a literal or metaphorical fence around our area of ownership. So we worked in partnership with a range of other land managers and stakeholders all along that catchment of the River Skell to deliver a whole range of different interventions, all aimed at slowing the flow to protect the abbey downstream, whilst also making the river better for nature and wildlife. It's a really nice example of those win-wins that we can find between heritage and nature. So planting 10,000 trees, planting kilometres of new and restored hedging, new ponds, leaky dams, and so on. And we're already actually seeing the benefits of that work and that project, which has just come into its conclusion. And again, in making these interventions, it gave us the opportunity to engage with the local communities around us, to interpret and share the story and the history of the river and how it's changed in the past and how it will continue to change into the future, and how people have always been a really pivotal part of that, and our decisions, what we want from a place. And again, that it's that sense that a key part of our adaptation approach will almost always need to not just be about the stuff in supporting and sustaining our heritage, but actually is about the people who value the stuff and connect with it. And from the wet to the dry, the impacts of droughts and increasing periods of extreme heat are also having an impact, as I know you're only too well aware up in Hadrian's Wall country when it comes to the effects on the preservation of archaeology in waterlogged or what may once have been waterlogged contexts, and we share some of those very direct impacts too. So for instance, here returning to Wicken Fen, which I mentioned earlier, which represents part of the 1% of the fens which hasn't been drained, and where we know from excavation and coring that the surviving peat overlies a prehistoric landscape and contains itself archaeological evidence of amazing importance over a period of some 3,000 years, right through to the late Roman period, and whose preservation is very actively threatened by those intense hot periods, the drying out, desiccation of the peat. And so here we're working to keep water on the site for longer through things like bunding around the site, but we're also exploring approaches to monitoring, particularly working in partnership with our natural environment colleagues, recognizing that peat has, again, is one of those things that is of immense value across those different professions or silos of interest. And so we're looking at not just things like moisture, but also things like microbial activity in the peat, and trying to understand and test through field work how some of these different indicators and the monitoring results might link to an understanding of the tipping points of risk and survival for the archaeological remains, and ultimately helping us to understand when the decay and degradation of archaeological material due to the changing peat conditions might mean that we need to switch from a preservation in situ approach to a preservation by record approach, and looking at rescue excavation. And in many respects, climate change hazards operate as what we might refer to as threat multipliers. For archaeological earthworks, they can make the risks of things like footpath erosion or poaching by livestock much worse. On clay geology, the shrink heave effects from wet and dry periods become more extreme, leading to collapses of standing remains. And intense rainfall and storm events can exacerbate erosion or result in more tree throws, which disturb archaeology and so on. And it's all forcing us to rethink in some places some of our conservation practice, whether that's around consolidation and soft capping for ruins and greater intervention there, or our approach to archaeological earthworks. So for instance, where we might in the past have sought to remove vegetation from features, fearing that bioturbation from root growth. We're actually making more nuanced decisions, taking into account the evidential value, the significance, the legibility of the archaeology, and recognizing that actually sometimes supporting more scrubby vegetation or woodland cover can sometimes be the best option to protect and support the long-term resilience of those features. Or thinking about changes to access, changes to visitor routes, changes to grazing regimes, and so on. There's a huge amount to consider, and you can see actually on the left hand side up on Mam Tor in the peaks, the erosion on the Iron Age hill fort there and earlier burial mounds, particularly driven by visitor access but exacerbated by some of those climate change impacts, has required some really major interventions and hard interventions. And in such a remote site, that's been pretty tricky, even involving the use of helicopters to transport material in for some of the repairs. So there are often no easy or one-size-fits-all answers for all of this. We've been working with regulators and the International National Trusts Organization, or INTO, to develop climate adaptation guidance, though, including around archaeology. That's available through the INTO website. And this has included some of our ideas around adaptation pathway planning, building in that recognition of uncertainty, of the variability of site-specific solutions and tipping points for action, but giving a framework to build our adaptation plans, always testing, monitoring, reviewing. So you can see here the sort of tube map approach almost, with a range of options or pathways, each having a stop point, a threshold of condition, for instance, where a new adaptation route may need to be pursued. And while there are many challenges for the heritage in our landscapes driven by climate change, there are also really big opportunities. So woodland creation, for instance, is a huge strand of climate mitigation work, with the National Trust working towards its 20 million trees target. And this is presenting us with amazing opportunities for discovery. So for instance, here at Attingham, in Shropshire, the National Trust undertook its largest ever geophysical survey across about 1,000 hectares of land on the Attingham estate to inform the design of our woodland creation there, accounting for the potential archaeology. And the results were truly incredible, revealing this really densely occupied prehistoric and Roman landscape, which we did suspect, particularly around the Roman city of Wroxeter. And you can see that in the pull-out box, the amazing view of the sort of street layouts and cemeteries and industry and religious sites. But we would not have had the opportunity to really understand that without the driver of delivering climate mitigation and the change that is prompting. And these discoveries have then led to the development of further programs of excavation and community engagement. So it can be a real catalyst for future research. And kind of pleasingly, the geophysics actually gave us the data and the confidence to identify more possible areas for woodland creation than had originally been planned on the estate. And in fact, we really want to put heritage and archaeology and the understanding it gives us of past landscapes in the driving seat to identify opportunities for nature recovery and carbon sequestration into the future. So we know that archaeology can help us contextualize landscape change. It reminds us that landscapes have always changed in the past, and it can inspire us to think about change for the future and confront things like shifting baseline syndrome when it comes to the abundance of nature, ranging from prehistoric peats to, for instance, research that we've done mapping traditional orchards, which used to exist in such amazing abundance up to the last 100 years. Yeah, the archaeology can help us identify practical nature restoration opportunities that can support tackling climate change as well. So we can understand how to re-wet historically drained wetlands. We can identify evidence of lost woodlands from charcoal burning platforms, the banks of former field boundaries, the earthwork depressions of former ghost ponds. And we know, for instance, that restoring a ghost pond actually delivers better outcomes and faster results as you reactivate dormant seabeds. And I know where you are right now. The National Park and the National Trust are working together with others on the early stages of the Hadrian's Wall Wetland Landscape Recovery Scheme, looking to create that climate resilient landscape. And the only landscape recovery scheme actually so far to have direct Historic England investment, actively seeking to develop the best practice in sustaining that legibility of the historic environment in nature recovery programs, and celebrating and enhancing those connections between cultural heritage and the natural environment. And there are other co-benefits too, for instance, in changing land use away from arable farming, which we know disturbs the soil and releases carbon. In this case, reversion to species-rich chalk grassland at the Stonehenge and Avery World Heritage Site. So delivering benefits for climate and biodiversity, as well as protecting the incredible archaeology across that landscape for the future. And we've now been able to deliver that change across all of our land there. And just over the last 4 years, that's meant 200 hectares of land being removed from arable cultivation. So a really huge win for nature and heritage and climate. So where next? Well, we will continue learning. We will continue sharing, continue testing. We know there will be difficult decisions, but we're also hopeful that we and our heritage can adapt, that heritage and archaeology are part of the answer to climate change, that they can give us the perspective and the inspiration and show us the opportunities for people and for nature. Ultimately, we believe that listening to our landscape histories is a fundamental part of resilient landscape futures, and that the work we all do to understand the past has even more relevance and resonance than ever in the context of climate change. So, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Cheers.
The advantage of being the last speaker is I have the opportunity to be quite reflective on some of the things that we've heard already today. The disadvantage is you've taken in a lot today, and I've just listed so far. We've done physics, chemistry, environmental science, pottery, beetles, pollen, leather, people, and I know I've missed something. So we've had lessons in quite a lot of things today. I wanted to start though, sorry, I'm not on my slide. I wanted to start actually with a quote that I jotted down from a slide that Siobhan showed earlier, which was more worldwide cooperation and more digital visibility of this cooperation. And fortunately, World Heritage, I think, is a very good exemplar of that. And obviously we are sitting in a World Heritage property here, or part of, and it's part of a collaborative and international side of things. I also want to mention that, in effect, this is very much, I've put Scott Heron and John Day's names down on this because what I'm presenting is very much their intellectual property, and this is very much the partnership and a collaborative approach. They're also based at James Cook University, which is in Queensland. So again, that's back to that international side of things. Now, when we think about the advisory bodies to UNESCO, which are essentially ICOMOS for monuments and also the IUCN for nature, but then also the Union of Concerned Scientists. These are the sort of some of the classic quotes that generally get trotted out, which it is one of the most significant and fastest growing threats to people and their heritage. It's important to have the people in there, because it's not just the heritage. We're not just doing it in isolation. I think that came through really well in some of the presentations earlier. But also it's fast becoming one of the most significant risks. Now, that particular quote is nearly 10 years old now, and I think probably we would revise that now to say it probably is, you know, one of them. Well, it still is one of the most significant, because obviously in some parts of the world you've still got warfare and lots of other awful things going on. But we're talking about very significant risks here. Now, the Climate Vulnerability Index, which I'm just going to refer to as CVI from now onwards, and because I work with Australians, I always feel I ought to pronounce it with an Australian accent. So if I do dip into that, I'll apologise. But it was developed a number of years ago, and I'll just say Scott is an environmental physicist, and John was the site manager, one of the site managers for the Great Barrier Reef for 28 years. So they bring a different perspective. I'm kind of an archaeological interloper in part of this, but actually it's that balance of expertise and different people doing different things that actually helps bring it and create something that's valuable. And again, I think that's reflective of what we've heard today. Now, the whole point of the way it's been developed is for consistency. It can be used at all types of World Heritage properties. It's intended to be a systematic framework. It is based on scientific knowledge, but it's not overly complex. It's proactive. It also tries to put our climate impacts into context, and we look at adaptation strategies and more effective management, which I think probably reflects some of the things that Tom was just talking about just then. It also helps provide a benchmark, and it's repeatable. So in essence, it is values-based, science-driven, and community-focused. And I think we had that participatory practice again coming through earlier. And I'm mainly going to talk about the work we did on the Antonine Wall, but also then its wider applicability. And that was a workshop that was about bringing a range of the community together. Unfortunately, because of the timing of it, which was in early 2022, it was an online workshop, but I've done a number of workshops with them now, and we have done in person and online. So what the CVI does, sorry, I'm going to show some graphs as well, but they'll be a little bit different. But what it actually does is there are various climate risk assessments that are used, particularly for World Heritage. One of the unusual aspects of the CVI, which is one of the reasons why we've enjoyed using it so much, is because it actually looks at the community vulnerability. Most risk assessments focus on the site and the impacts on the site, whereas actually this one also then looks at the impact on the community and the extent to which the community depends on that. And again, I think that was reflected through. Now, just to say, it's been applied now at a number of properties on, I think we're at 4 continents now. So that's just to give an example. It uses IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, sort of typologies in terms of what are the key threats, what are the climate stressors, which are the ones down the left. And this is a list of some of the sites on the right that it's been applied to. So when I start to look at the Antonine Wall, the approach that we took is we looked at the statement of outstanding universal value, which I think Tom was introducing us to earlier, which is the reason why a site is inscribed. It has outstanding universal value to all humanity. That's why something gets inscribed. And then you have a statement of that, which is basically how we articulate why that site is important. And so in the case of the Antonine Wall, you know, I've got them listed here: highly developed frontier, artificial barrier, upstanding and underground remains, landscape and topography. I mean, obviously, I think probably we could say, I mean, in the sort of attributes in all of these, we've got the things about the turf monument and things that we were hearing from Tanya earlier. And here we've got some examples of the archaeology of the Antonine Wall for those of you who are not particularly familiar with it, including the fact that it is on a stone base. And I don't know if you can see, but in the case of this one, there's an awful lot of growth happening on that base, and sporadically they are cleaned up. But again, this is the contemporary impacts of aspects of climate change, and also then the concerns about the fragility of the monument. We've been talking about, you know, extremes of weather. We've been drought, sudden precipitation and flash flooding, and what impact that's going to have. So I want to mention, obviously, Tanya's work that we've heard from earlier. And one of the things that Tanya's been looking at is the makeup of that turf rampart, and the fact that she's managed to demonstrate that actually our assumptions about it being completely clay cheeked in the east are actually incorrect, and there's more turf there than we'd previously considered. So more of that kind of work in terms of understanding it, and then also understanding what the impacts of the pressures of climate change are going to have on these fragile turf monuments. And as she said, it is the largest turf monument in the Roman Empire. And then I think Gillian mentioned hydrology as well, and we have had a recent PhD student, Hazel Blake, who had a number of case studies that were around climate change, looking at, around world territories, looking at where water flows when it lands, again, to help with the site management. So that's another tool that we can think about. Now, in the process of doing the workshop, it was the importance of sort of combining techniques, which I think has been come through very clearly today, but also making sure we've got lots of the right people in the room representing the diverse community of interest that we have on our site. And we started off with a benchmarking of, okay, what's the key values? What are the key things in those key values? So this is all taken from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value. And they say, okay, since its inscription, which in the case of the Antonine Wall is 2008, where have these values improved, perhaps because of management regimes? Where have they stayed the same, and where have they deteriorated? So that's all sort of detailed in here. If anyone is interested in finding out more, I bought a box of these along with me, plus it's also available online. I've been very unenvironmentally friendly by bringing printed copies, but that they're there, and as I say, it's available as a download if anyone wants to look at them. Please do. So we start off with that, and then we look at the key stresses, and we get the people in the room to say what are the key stresses. And so over on the left here, you've got the chart. Unsurprisingly, in Scotland, rain is going to feature somewhere along the line, which it does. And, you know, I've got a couple of examples here of what a typical day on the Antonine Wall could look like. But then we've also got quite a complex, so say we've got the economic, social and cultural dimension. We've got quite a complex community. It runs through central Scotland. It runs through the most densely occupied parts of Scotland. It also has a really complex community around it. It runs through one of the most deprived parts of Glasgow. It also runs through one of the richest parts of Glasgow. And those two communities are a mile apart, because that is the nature of our diverse communities today. So, and we're also dealing with a monument. When people think of the Antonine Wall, when they think of a Roman wall, everyone has that wonderful image of Hadrian's Wall going up over the windsill or something. And we're there going, no, it's turf, it's not in stone. And generally what you can see is a big ditch. So actually we're kind of describing it a bit wrong. So actually there's been a series of projects recently which have been looking at how we visualize it, how we make it more attractive and make people care. One of the most successful of which was this fantastic sculpture, which was, again, a community named. There was a vote to name it. It's called Sylvanus. It's up on Croy Hill. But we also now have 5 Roman-themed play parks with information about the Romans all around them. So again, that's, I think somebody talked earlier about education. Get them while they're young. So what we then produced from this work was a series of sort of things looking at the 3 climate stresses. So the top 3 that we identified: precipitation trend, temperature trend. I know somebody talked about temperature earlier, and then intense precipitation events. These issues where you get sudden things leading to flooding and that side of things. We did identify some other ones, but these were the top 3, and that's the workshop setting. Is like take 3 and then look at its impact. Now Scott does all of the physics behind this, and he has Excel spreadsheets that produce these charts. So that's what that came from. But unsurprisingly, the bottom line is the monument, the vulnerability of the monument is high. That I don't think that really surprised any of us, but to actually get there through a process of doing it has been really important. In terms of the community vulnerability, the community does not rely as heavily on the monument because there's lots of other things going on in that part of central Scotland. So actually the community vulnerability is moderate. So when it comes to actually how we disseminate this information, I mentioned the report earlier. That's the other noticeable thing about working with scientists. The report has 8 authors on it because it's demonstrating it's very much a collaborative project. I did a poster on this at the Nijmegen Limes Congress, which was mentioned earlier, and a paper in the Batumi Georgia Limes Congress that was also mentioned earlier. And just to say that actually a lot of the work that we've been able to do on the Climate Vulnerability Index across Scotland has been thanks to a grant that we got from the Royal Society of Edinburgh some years ago. So I must acknowledge that. And it was a collaboration that was done between Historic Environment Scotland, where I was working at the time, and James Cook University in Scotland. So grateful acknowledgement to the funders. Now, in terms of the methodology, we did look at the climate change and where we've got sort of where the station's recording climate. We had a climate scientist is one of the authors of the report, and did a presentation at the start of it in the workshop setting to actually then say, okay, how are the climate impacts? What's happening? And unsurprisingly, you know, it rains a lot. It's wetter in the west than the east, which I think most of us who kind of live in Scotland know that. But actually, again, it's about having that scientific data that then drives that decision making the way you present it. And although we did a full, you know, the Rolls-Royce version of the CVI, Scott and John have been developing up different approaches to it, which is, you know, various types of snapshots and different approaches. So it is possible to apply this methodology without necessarily having to have a week-long workshop, which is what we actually did, although we split it over 2 weeks. And because it was online, we were also dealing with major time zone differences. So we were starting early in the morning, and Scott and John, I think, were wanting to have a beer at the end of the session, whereas for us, it was lunchtime. I think, again, Tom, you showed the wheel earlier. So we've got the 3 main areas, but we also then said, okay, we are concerned about warming and cooling. We are concerned about the potential for other forms of sea change, because we've got coastal sites at either end of the wall. So what are the things that people are identifying? And in other areas, drought could easily be identified. So this was this is a stressor wheel. So I took the results from the workshop and plotted them on a wheel. And, you know, again, I think Jackie, you were talking about the significance of temperature events earlier, and that's certainly come through in aspects of this. But then just to say, I also then did a sort of snapshot of where we're at with Hadrian's Wall, thanks to Andy and colleagues, and also the Upper German Reich and Limes, thanks to Susanna Matejczyk. And I don't think it's a massive surprise that we're all basically saying, yeah, the water cycle and temperature and wind and storms are the main concerns in Northwest Europe. No massive surprise there, but again, it's useful to have this information documented when we're thinking about the management, because these 3 sites are one World Heritage property. So we have to operate in a collaborative manner. And just say from a Scotland perspective, Scotland has 7 World Heritage properties. We've done 4 with this full methodology now, again, partly thanks to the Royal Society of Edinburgh funding. And then we've also done a snapshot for a 5th one, which was the Flow Country. So again, so these are the various sites, and it has been interesting to see, you know, where sites have got, you know, extreme high vulnerability and where they've got slightly lower vulnerability. And I think it's no surprise that the prehistoric and Roman sites of Orkney and the Antonine Wall are that have the most extreme impacts, have the high impacts in relation to their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Edinburgh, the city of Edinburgh, it's moderate, it's there, but it's not quite as extreme. And ditto with St Kilda, which actually I think surprised us, because St Kilda is really quite acute. When it comes to the community, none of the communities actually that we have identified so far really rely on it from an economic side of things. If Orkney lost its status, Orkney would still carry on being a major tourist destination, which is a big part of its economy. I don't doubt for a second that tourism would reduce, but it's still got its economic drivers. Curiously, or perhaps less so, St Kilda had very low community vulnerability, but for those of you that don't know St Kilda, nobody lives there. However, it has a global community, because when the community was evacuated from St Kilda in 1930, they then went global. So there's a St Kilda society that has global membership because of that Scottish diaspora that we have there. But actually, you know, but the other process that this does by bringing everybody together is you identify all the research gaps. And one of the acute things for St Kilda, which is a mixed property, is the impact that climate change is having on the seabird population, which again has been identified as being quite acute. So what does that then mean? Well, I think, Gillian, you were talking about the aerobic and anaerobic conditions and the issue of this wet-dry cycle, sort of doing things. And actually, I'm going to summarize one of the other papers earlier. What was it? Warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers is basically the outcome of a lot of the charts that we were looking at earlier. And I mean, Beth, you were talking about the impact of losing the weather. We were also hearing about the potential impacts on other objects and the fact that this is leading to an unstable environment, subsurface, that is destroying objects. And it was interesting to just hear from Tom about the way in which the National Trust is now prioritising the way it does things. And the argument I would then use, so I've got obviously some examples of wood and leather on the screen here, and hopefully Marta doesn't mind, that actually, that for those of you online, that was Marta making a remark. The answer has to be that we have to prioritise these sites for excavation. We are losing knowledge. And so when we're thinking about where we're going to dig next, we as an archaeological sector need to be prioritising the sites where we are losing information, but also the sites where we know there's likely to be a high amount of valuable buried remains. So it's the waterlogged deposits, it's that side of things. So the next thing is where next? So, because obviously I've been talking about the CVI. Well, they're looking at creating more documentation to guide people, looking at how they do training. I'm absolutely delighted to say that earlier this year they were awarded funding from the Getty Sustainability Fund for a number of fellowships who will be trained up with Scott and John in Queensland, but actually at least one of them is likely to be based with me for a couple of months in Edinburgh. So there is the potential for us to do more from a Roman frontiers perspective. So they're looking at how this can be then applied globally, because I think they've done something like somewhere between 20 and 30 applications. There are over 1,000 World Heritage properties. So in actually to make this a useful methodology, we need to have different scales of the way it's applied, and we need to actually then have that toolkit for people to be able to do that. And then they've obviously been looking at where it can be applied. They've done quite a bit in Africa, and they've done quite a number of sites in Europe, also on the Indian subcontinent as well, and some in Australia, unsurprisingly. I thought I'd mention Scott and John. Scott has become a UNESCO chair as a result of this work, so that's been recognised by them, and he is currently based in Paris on a 6-month secondment with UNESCO, helping support them in their understanding and learning on climate change. And as I say, John sort of retired from the Barrier Reef and then did a post-career PhD at James Cook University. So they're quite a dynamic duo. And really just to say that if you're interested in hearing more, you can sign up. I bought an example with them. You can sign up to get one of their newsletters. They're short, they're 2 sides of A4. They come out either 3 or 4 times a year, so you do not get bombarded. But the website that they have has, which I think is, if I click the button again, yeah, CVI Heritage, has every single report that they've done and some YouTube and video things all available to be downloaded. So if you're interested in looking at this further, do come and take a copy of the Antonine Wall report, because I don't want to take a box of them home with me again. But also do sign up and get, as I say, their periodic newsletters. And otherwise, it's to say thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, Becky, for, as always, an inspirational talk. And you've done my job beautifully for me, because you've also summed up the conference very, very well. So I appreciate that on both levels, as no doubt as everybody else in the room too. But we do have time just for a couple of questions, if anybody has a couple of questions before we draw proceeding to a close. Rachel.
The community impact identified in the index is relatively low, moderate for the Antonine Wall. Has that informed strategies going forward to increase community investment in the walls, so we don't want them to suffer detrimentally if things were to change, but has that sort of flagged up as an area to try and increase local investment in the wall?
So the question for those online is this was around using it to because of its moderate impact on the community, using it to think about how we increase the impact of the wall on the local community. I mean, we're fortunate that when we did the workshop, which I say was coming up for 4 years ago now, we were also in the stages of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, which has been around that community, which has led to the play parks. It's led to some major capital investment, as well as a series of educational resources and various things. So I hope that we have, over the course of the last few years, done quite a lot on increasing certainly the visibility. I mean, when we were starting to think about the impact, I mean, there are a lot of businesses that run along the wall that would still operate regardless of whether the wall was a World Heritage property or not, because this is, you know, around the World Heritage significance. But it is interesting to see how many use the word Antonine in the thing, and that has been a growing area. I've not worn them today, but I have some jewellery that was made by a jeweller who calls herself Antonine Silver. And so she, you know, and she does various themed things. But so you do have some of these ones, but in essence, it's not a massive tourism site. It's more for the local community. And actually, there have been interviews with dog walkers, for example, who use it as a nice place to walk their dog. And whether it's Roman or not, it just happens to be a convenient park. So we've got various other bits and pieces of research going on, which are looking at that side of things. I think it can be used, it should be used to inform what we do going forward. But at the end of the day, you don't necessarily want the community to be massively dependent on the World Heritage status, but you do want that visibility of the monument. So that's obviously where we want to get to. And again, it's around workshops, it's about working with partners, it's about increasing that visibility. Schools are obviously a key one, but also families and communities, and actually how we drive that in. One of the advantages, I think, one of the positive things about the Antonine Wall is the fact that actually, because, you know, of the nature of its survival, you don't have to pay to visit any bit of it, because it is just pockets in the landscape. So I've always argued, when you're dealing with communities and people that might say, actually, heritage is expensive, sites are expensive to visit, we can say, well, actually, you don't have to pay to visit the Antonine Wall, but it's not that easy to get to necessarily, depending on where you are. So you've got different challenges. We have a digital app that people can use, but again, it's about promoting the fact that exists. So yeah, it's all work in progress, I think. Long answer, sorry.
Oh no, thank you. We've got 2 more questions.
Did the methodology take into account that it might be the possibility there could be benefits to losing the status? So I asked because they're quite public, you know, uproar in the summer after some very knowledgeable people suggested that the Lake District would be better off not being a World Heritage site, because effectively people are trying to maintain an artificial snapshot of what people believe existed at the time of the Romantic poets, which is ecologically poor, but because people are so wedded to that idea, and because UNESCO said that's what it's meant to be, that we can, you know, there's elements that can't be improved.
It is something that has come up, because obviously I've run several workshops now. It has come up at some of the workshops with regards to the loss, what would the loss of OUV and potential loss of status mean? But actually, and it's probably partly because the people we've got in the room, at no point has anyone felt that it would be anything positive would come out of the loss of status. There was the one site that I think was recognising that there was potential for it was Orkney. And that wasn't because they wanted it to happen at all. It was more the case of Skara Brae is possibly going to be swamped. I mean, it was discovered through the sea coming in 1850. At some point in the next 100 years, I think is our general estimate, it's going to go, unless the seawall is continually built and maintained, and the extent to which that is. But actually, the community were quite sanguine on the fact that actually the community impact they will still have the memories of it. And actually, the amount of geophysics that's gone on suggests that there's more stuff there that hasn't been dug. So, so it's possibly that we haven't had the detractors in the room when we've had the workshops. But no, I'm pleased to say we haven't really had. The only one where somebody kind of, there might have been a bit of grumbling is Edinburgh, unsurprisingly, because people want to do developments and some things can and can't get stopped. But to be honest, whether it was a World Heritage Site or not, the planners are always going to put sensible measures on that basically say, no, not that building in that location. So.
Thank you, Becky. Final question, Marta. Same question.
Some papers regarding the negative impact of World Heritage status on local community in the sort of southern hemisphere. It's been much true of that, and I was wondering if that is the case.
I think the biggest impact that people tend to complain about, certainly in the UK, is over tourism, to be honest. I think, and of course you combine that with the vulnerability of a site and the amount of footfall, that's an additional pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you once more, Becky. Can everybody give Becky another round?